In 1980, Gary Cosette was a 29-year-old corporate real estate broker between jobs when a friend from college invited him to bike across the United States with him. Gary's friend, Blake Ortman, had recently returned from 2 years in Honduras, where he served as a Mennonite volunteer, working with refugees from El Salvador who were crossing the border into Honduras to escape violent civil war that erupted in their country in 1979. A new government, calling themselves the Revolutionary Government Junta, came to power in El Salvador in 1979. They used the military to arrest and torture opponents and kill and terrorize people at every level of society throughout the country. Soon, the FMLN, the Farabundo Martin National Liberation Front, formed to oppose the junta. The U.S. government, concerned about communist influence in Latin America, supported this right-wing government with extensive military aid.
And they had fled the violence in the countryside of a military scorched earth policy that they explained to me. They said as they were organizing to form unions and to press for inclusive change, they were met with repression. And that repression grew. Priests and community leaders were assassinated by the military at the behest of an economic elite in El Salvador, the powerful oligarchy they were called, the 14 families. And as those assassinations continued with impunity by the military and the police, some began to take up arms to defend themselves and formed the FMLN guerrillas. So this whole movement of the army into rural areas was an attempt to go after the guerrillas, but not so much go after the guerrillas, but anyone that they perceived might support the guerrillas. And they targeted the civilian population. The goal was to go in, carry out a massacre, and with the idea that anyone who remained would flee.
In 1980, two violent events shook El Salvador and many people in the United States. On March 26, 1980, the Archbishop of San Salvador, Oscar Romero, was shot and killed as he celebrated the Eucharist at the altar of a hospital chapel in the capital. Romero, a conservative priest elevated in 1977, had been transformed by the assassination of his fellow priest, Rutilio Grande, into a strong and eloquent defender of the poor majority of his country. 9 months later, in December of 1980, 3 young American nuns and 1 Catholic lay worker were kidnapped by 5 Salvadoran National Guardsmen as they left the airport in San Salvador. The bodies of Ida Ford, Jean Donovan, Dorothy Kazel, and Mara Clark were exhumed from a shallow grave in the hills above the capital 2 days later. Both Romero and the 4 women were killed by paramilitary death squad members trained in the United States at the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. By 1983, Gary Cosette's friend, Blake Ortman, had moved to El Salvador with the Mennonite volunteers, and he asked his friend Gary to visit. It was the first time that Gary had been to Latin America. It was a transformative experience.
What most impacted me on that visit was the words of 2 women who accompanied me in a visit to a refugee camp that was operated by the Archdiocese of San Salvador. The refugees of San Jose de la Montaña told me that they were working in their fields, they were in their homes, and the military came in and killed anyone who they encountered. So word spread quickly, and people fled into the mountains to hide. And from the mountains, they lived maybe for a week or 2, living on whatever they could find. They just escaped with their lives with nothing. And from those rural areas in the mountains, they either went across the border into Honduras or through a network of churches found their way into the capital, into these refugee camps. And there was a dozen of them in San Salvador. So they told me, as I went family to family, what had happened to them, how their family members had been killed, how their communities had been machine gunned, their animals killed, sometimes at areas where these two women sat me down on a wall by the flanking the seminary and said, "Thank you for your visit." Said, "Internationals coming here is important because we are always under surveillance by the military, and it lets them know that we are not alone and isolated." They said, however, but we ask that you go back and tell your president not to send the bombs that are destroying our villages and the bullets that are killing our families. And that message had weighed on me when I came back. I thought about it all the time as I was driving to my different real estate appointments, about how the most powerful nation in the world, the United States, was sending weapons and military training to El Salvador that was killing hundreds and thousands of people. And the people that were being killed are the poorest people in our hemisphere. They're the ones who have the least, and the little that they had was being obliterated. Their families, their towns, their communities, their homes, everything destroyed by weapons from our country. And we here in the United States were going on as if nothing happened. We were unaware largely of what was happening, and when we heard about it, it was through the lens of the State Department that was telling us that they were supporting Salvadoran democracy that was defending itself against communism. And this was not true at all. These were deeply ingrained social injustices that people were struggling against. The poor, who had been dispossessed of their lands for centuries, were demanding that they be included. And the churches were standing with them, particularly the Catholic Church at that time, Archbishop Romero.